Asians are kind of natural mediators, especially in race issues, right? Because we're not really like the oppressed minority archetype, but you're not a white person either. You're kind of in this liminal zone where people don't really know where the hell they fit.
Our viewpoint is not being considered in this literally black-white divide. Honestly, our viewpoint is actually extremely important. We automatically are outside of the polls.
And in the polarization and vitriol, a lot of nuances around issues of identity and so forth were lost. We also saw a lot of tribalizing divisions. And I thought Diaphanous was a particularly relevant metaphor because that aspect of transparency captures the lived reality and gravity that race has in our society, but also not reifying it to such a degree where it can actually perpetuate an actually centralized reality. The more controversial and heated and radioactive the topic is, the more I'm just like a heat-seeking missile. I just gravitate to it flight. The more heated the conflict is, the more potential there is for transformation.
So that was actually one of your last sessions there? Because that was actually one of my first sessions.
Oh, that's funny. They swapped out one Asian guy for another Asian guy.
Again, the first exclusively yellow-faced episode in the Sensemaking community. Watch this, rewind it, send it to all your people. Welcome everyone to another brand new episode of Noetic Nomads. I'm Albert Kim, and no, you are not seeing double, because with me today is actually not my twin, but rather a profound futon philosopher. He's been a student of integral theory for nearly half his 28 years on Earth, who synthesized his experience with spirituality as son of a Buddhist minister and as attendee of Ananda University, with that of progressive left socio-political theory and practice, to co-create projects such as the Growing Down podcast with Jeremy Johnson and Matt Hudkins, the Outreach Project, Perspectivepedia, which aims to listen to voices all across the political spectrum, and now his pièce de résistance, the Diaphanous anti-racism framework, which proposes a nuanced and holistic middle way to bridge the divide between the polarized camps on racial justice, to move us all toward the more beautiful world we know in our hearts is possible. Nomads, please help me in introducing an integral rapper, meta goat whisperer, potential future presidential candidate, and someone who may be yellow on the outside, but teal on the inside. I can be speaking about the one and only Ryan Nakade. Thank you so much for coming on today, Ryan.
Dude, that was literally the best introduction I've ever heard in my entire life. You made me sound way cooler. So I hope I can live up to that in this.
Oh my, dude! I mean, like, just you being you. I mean, like, trust me. Like, my whole goal with this is bringing amazing people like you on, and actually not pumping you up, but letting you see how amazing you are. So again, I could have kept going on and on, but thank you so much for coming on again, Ryan.
Oh, thank you, my friend, and yeah, it's my pleasure, and really excited to see what comes out of this discussion today.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So I don't know if you recall the first time that we came across each other. Like, I mean, like, we're kind of like in like these realms, but like the first time what is the first time you recall encountering me? Because I think maybe we might have different recollections.
You know what's funny? So I was watching your talk with Aaron Rajarson.
Yeah. And
I think he was talking about, it was a Stoa session where he first saw you. I forgot the topic. It was like on some controversial gender-related issue or something. I think that was the first time I saw you in one of the calls, and that was actually one of the last Stoa events I attended live and participated in because I got busy with other things. So I remember seeing you there, and I don't remember seeing you before that. So.
Wow, you nailed it, because that's exactly the first recollection. I actually recall, for whatever reason, I recall exactly what happened. It was the Ariel Friedman session. What was it with?
Yes.
What was it? Dangerous
Space. Yeah,
Dangerous Space. And I believe that the topic pick was like, what is a female, or something to that effect.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. And I remember specifically you joining the chat. And I was like, oh, dude, a fellow yellow face is here. That's the first time I've seen that. And then I mentioned StarCraft. For some reason, I specifically remember somehow in my like little wild rants, I mentioned StarCraft, and then you're like, oh yeah, StarCraft. And it's like, so like that's, so that's definitely the first time I recall seeing you. So it was again at the Stoa. So Yeah. So again, we're on the same. So that was actually one of your last sessions at there, because that was actually one of my first sessions. So I
Oh,
guess
that's
that
funny.
like,
They swapped out one Asian guy for another Asian guy.
yeah, I had fit in the quota, like, yeah.
Right, exactly, right. What's funny about the StarCraft, I remember the StarCraft comment too, because I typed in the chat, I was like, oh, I'm not good at StarCraft because I'm Japanese. I don't have Korean genes, so
Yeah.
I'm naturally disqualified from StarCraft and League of Legends.
I mean, like, here's the thing. Like, I know I'm Korean, but I'm actually terrible at StarCraft. Like, I just don't have, the APM. I'm like, brrr, they have like measure APM, how many actions you can do per minute.
Oh,
Like,
right.
it's like after a while, like if I'm like drinking a lot of caffeine or something like that, energy drinks, like I could do that for a while, but then after a point, I was just like, F this, man. Like this is too much work, man. Like I don't have that sort of crazy like drive. Like Koreans are crazy competitive, which I'm sure we'll get into later about what is driving this Korean stuff. But yeah, I mean, like I went into your history and like into your story. I was like, wow. I mean, you had some like very unconventional upbringing. So I was wondering if I may ask what your parents did for a living and how that impacted the path you've taken in your life.
Sure, yeah. Well, you are correct that I've had a rather unconventional upbringing and background. My mom is a Buddhist minister, a Soto Zen Buddhist minister in Hawaii, on the Big Island of Hawaii in Kona. She runs a temple called Daifukuji Soto Mission. And so I actually grew up in this Buddhist temple, not a residential monastic community, just me and my family lived in the temple, but it's a community of about 200 members. It's been around since 1914 was when it was founded. So it's been around for quite a long time. And so I was very much immersed in, Buddhism, Eastern thought, and had, wonderful relationships with other community members who were interested in studying and practicing Zen Buddhism. And my dad is a teacher. He teaches AP US history now in California.
Oh, I see.
So it was interesting because my dad his actual academic background is in philosophy and theology. And he's a New Testament scholar by training, and my mom is more focused on Buddhist practice and that kind of thing. So I had that kind of interesting East-West confluence going on there in my family. Interesting dinner conversations, and then that kind of later naturally segued into my interest in integrated frameworks. Like we're kind of bringing these East-West frameworks together in a kind of integrated whole, which kind of natural led to my interest in things like integral theory, now metamodernism, and other sense-making movements. So kind of how I got to where I am today.
Yeah, and like, so I mean, obviously with your last name, I'm sorry if I butchered it. Like, how do I pronounce it? Nakade?
Yeah, Nakade.
Nakade. And so I believe you mentioned to me that your father is, of course, Japanese. Is your mother is also Japanese, or?
Yeah, my mom is also Japanese. She's, I think, like a third or fourth generation from Japanese from Hawaii, whereas my dad is from Japan.
Okay, interesting. So wait, so that's actually something very interesting. So you said your father was a New Testament scholar. So that's very interesting because like when you think about like Christianity, that's not really big in East Asian communities. Like I would say the most like Christian like East Asian kind of grouping is actually like Korean. Like South Koreans they're kind of crazy. They can be kind of like crazy right-wing nationalists. I believe like our history is part of it. But I mean, so how did your father get into those kind of studies? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've actually asked him that before, and he moved to Arizona when he was 16 from Japan as an exchange student, high school exchange student. And I think he had some run-ins with Christianity, either with his host family or just in, the general culture of Arizona. And I think that was kind of like a tension that he was grappling with or wanted to explore more deeply. So he majored in religion in undergrad at the University of Hawaii, where he met my mom, and then had got 2 master's degrees in theology. As a way of kind of exploring that. And, he's not Christian, but he had a lot of interest in the New Testament, and also kind of the philosophy and theology, guys like Kierkegaard and, other Christian existentialists like Paul Tillich, Gabriel Marcel. So that's kind of his background that he came from. Then eventually went to teaching U.S. history. And again, the same thing of not being from America, but having, as a Japanese person, really cultivating an interest in American history and U.S. politics and social issues. So we talk a lot about, all these things that we'll probably get into today, race
Yeah, yes.
relations and all that juicy stuff.
Okay, yeah, and definitely like to start getting into this. There's a lot of juicy stuff we could talk about here. So again, you reached out to me. It was on Thanksgiving, and so like I on that day, my video on Game C, the framework for meta utopia, was published on Bruce Alderman's channel, The Integral Stage. And you reached out to me and you're like, hey, Albert, I mean, I like this. And I was like, wow, really? Because I mean, like, I had no idea what the reaction was going to be like. Cause I was just like, Bruce, I mean, like the story was, I was on, I'm active on the Game B Facebook to some extent. And like, he posted his Utopia, a video from his Utopia series about how people, about how like all these different thinkers, like, especially from the integral realm, but also like Michelle Bowens and Jeremy had his video on that series. And then I was like, wow, this is really interesting, because I had been thinking about a meta utopia, just slightly playing with it in the background. I had done like no real work on it, right? So I just mentioned to him, oh, Mick, can you put these on podcasts? Because I love to listen to these, but like, like I don't have the time to like watch all these on video. He was like, oh, sure. And then he was like, wait a minute, you're doing something on meta utopia. And then he's like, do you want to do something? And now, mind you, I had done literally nothing. Like I literally just like, I had just kind of thought of the term, but I had done no actual work on any of this Game C meta utopia stuff. But once he offered that to me, I was like, you know what? I'm not supposed to be doing this, but I'm going to take this opportunity. I'm going to run with it. And so like a couple weeks later, like within like a week, I just put everything together. And that's how the entire framework was put out. So yeah, so I mean, like, so you contacted me, and then I was like, oh, that's very interesting. And we had a little chat, and then maybe, and you told me like, and yeah, I mean, I like your video. And also like, I liked your little, your post you made on Discord about like Japanese and Korean relations. And perhaps one day we could talk about it. And I was like, yeah, I mean, sure, definitely. Maybe we could have a conversation. Later on that day, I see you post in Medium, the DAR framework, right? And I'm like, where the hell did this come from? So I'm like, if you could just like let our audience know and let me know, because I'm very curious, like, what was it? Like, can you tell us a story behind DAR's creation and like what DAR even stands for? I mean, for those who don't recall what it stands for.
Sure. Yeah. Well, DAR stands for Diaphanous Anti-Racism, which is quite a funny, weird mixture of words. Yeah. And diaphanous is a word that I actually learned from Jeremy Johnson, the Gebser aficionado, and Gene Gebser, who is a integral philosopher, one of the kind of original integral thinkers, used the term diaphaneity to describe the integral structure and one of its key properties, which is this quality of transparency or translucency that comes along with being able to see through things, and in doing so rendering kind of wholeness of reality, right? By having all of these different perspectives or structures of consciousness rendered transparent, we're able to see through them, but also acknowledge their existence in a kind of larger tapestry of wholeness that we're cultivating, that we're concretizing, right? And so I thought that was a helpful metaphor to apply to race and the general sense-making conversation around race, which I have found particularly frustrating and aggravating, as have a lot of people, including in sense-making spaces, because I still felt like there were a lot of gray areas that needed to be carved out. And in the polarization and vitriol, a lot of nuances around issues of identity and so forth were lost. And I still saw a lot of tribalizing divisions and around the topic without really an integrative way forward that was both affirmative in cultivating a positive vision of what I thought was a healthy and positive way of thinking and talking about race would be, and also concrete actionable steps where we can start implementing a new way of thinking. And I thought diaphaneity was a particularly relevant metaphor because it captured that aspect of transparency, captures the reality, the lived reality and gravity that race has in our society, but also not reifying it or fossilizing it to such a degree where it becomes so real that it can actually like perpetuate racism or being overly race conscious, right? Can kind of lead to us forgetting about the larger systemic structures and backgrounds that create race, and we mistake the construct that it is for an actually centralized reality, which I think is dangerous and kind of regressive or counterproductive. And so the diaphaneity model was kind of my way of both anding it to say, by seeing through it, that implies we acknowledge its existence, but also rendering transparent allows us to see beyond it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, like, again, like, I'm totally with that, and it kind of does. I could kind of see, like, I wonder if, like, maybe what I spoke about in the Game C video, and in the Game C video, is what resonate with you. Was part of it maybe perhaps the fact that I did bring up race, and then I even brought up gender, and like all the lack of maybe contextualizing within the Game B framework. Because again, like in this whole sense making space, when it comes to topics, you know, you call it the traditional, maybe progressive, you know, social justice topics. It's just, it seems very like reactionary centrist, like anti-woke mindset. And like, even like when you go to the more meta crowd, to me, and like this is actually something that I'd be interested in getting into. The thing about meta is you're kind of going out from, like, you know, 10,000 feet up and looking at it, but it's kind of like you're also kind of like disembodied and you're removed from it, rather than what you're saying with like diaphanity is you're actually embedded within the context, and you see it. But again, you're not reifying it, you're not concretizing it, you can see through it. So like, it's very interesting. So could you go into basically what do you see, how do you frame the current like racial what was it, like the racial camps in America when it comes to justice?
Oh yeah, so in the article I lined out, you know, one of the tensions, one of the core debates, which has become quite a polarizing debate, is what is the end goal of racial justice? Is it color blindness, where we don't see race or really, you know, what the colorblind camp says, quoting Martin Luther King, is, you know, judging people by the concept of their character, not based on skin color, and favoring instead more like modernist values of universal humanity, where people are treated as individuals and not stereotyped in terms of group identity, right? And then on the other hand, we have the race conscious school, which says that, you know, the lived reality of race is so great because, it's something we need to really acknowledge and really understand deeply, because there are so many systemic and historical injustices and inequities. They produce enough of a racial difference or distinction that these distinctions need to be captured, or else you're losing some important differences, material and psychological differences that have come about of these greater societal forces and injustices and inequities, right? And so my way was trying to go between those two and be able to see through race, and not have race become a dominating or totalizing heuristic that occludes, you know, people's unique individuality or interior psychological reality. We're not steamrolling the unique individuality of a person with collectivized, unnuanced sociological generalizations, but we're able to still take those into consideration and complexify our understanding of identity, and how our individual perspectives are shaped and molded by larger background contextual forces that are usually invisible at first glance. And so it's really, again, it's a way of trying to integrate the best of both of the camps and move the conversation forward in a way that explicitly cautions us about not overusing a racial lens too much, and instead nesting it in a larger framework of complexity for a more holistic analysis, rather than just attributing everything to racism or racial issues.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this framework, and like over time, I realized that like I may actually be like, I don't know, like a proto-integral or kind of integralist, like on the inside, because there in the sense making space is like the problem with the sense making space is that they're the sense making space. It's just like, oh, look at us, we're the big brainy types who understand everything, and we're above everything. That's part of what I see as problems with the whole meta framework. You actually think that you're above everyone else, both in terms of like the viewpoint, as in like going outside the viewpoint, outside the context, but also thinking that there's some sort of hierarchy that, oh, we get it, we're smarter than everyone else. And again, like in my recent episode with Gabriel, who's also like a Game C rapper, I don't know if you're a rapper as well, an integral rapper, so a Game C rapper, integral rapper, and we talked about like all these people who preach that they're Game B, is like they're 99% Game A. It's like they think they're smarter than everyone else, they think they're above it, when really, I mean, like they have these same blind spots as everyone else. And like, I've literally come across people like in some of these sessions where it's like, we're talking about blind spots. That's right. It's like, we're specifically talking about how we have biases, and they say, oh, I don't have that problem. It's like, I'm less biased than most people. Literally, literally, like, what is that? Like, I forget which bias it is. It's like literally the biggest bias is thinking that you're not as biased as everyone else. And it's just like, these people in these spaces actually think that. And that's actually what I brought up in my Game C video. It's like we can't think that, we objectively, know everything, that, that these are like universalist principles. That's very colonialist thinking. That's very, I believe, orange thinking in the integral framework, right? So I was just wondering, like, if you could go a little bit into like what integral is as opposed to the meta view, because again, like within like my sense making space that I'm kind of coming out of, it's like, if the meta view is very popular, especially with the Stoa. But then I saw that you had a little exchange where you talk about maybe like a meta modern masculinity, such as like with Aaron proposes, and then make it like maybe a diaphanous masculinity. So what would be what is like the distinctions between more of a meta versus an integral or diaphanous? How would you say?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's a little tricky because within the large umbrella of integral, we have a whole bunch of different thinkers, right? The most famous one is Ken Wilber. I would consider Wilber to be a meta type of thinker.
Okay.
And so and Jeremy Johnson has a great article about this on I think it's called Liminal Magazine, and he talks about the meta. I think a meta perspective, jumping out of the context to take a 40,000 foot, surveying the field from a higher place, can be very helpful, right? Because when you're really in the trenches, in the mud, you miss a bigger picture, and so stepping back can be helpful to get a bigger picture. And so what tends to happen is you're privileging a kind of abstraction, as you were alluding to, right? There's a kind of disembodiment, and I think you were talking to Aaron about this on your talk, was and how that relates to masculinity, and what is the role of embodiment and so forth, right? And so one of the side effects is you can get very lost in the head, constantly trying to jump out of context and constantly trying to abstract out of lived reality, and a kind of in the immanence of lived reality. And so what Gebser, the other integral thinker, proposes is his model is not, his idea of the integral structure is not a meta jumping out, but a staying within and seeing through something. And so it has a more embodied connotation or feel or ethos to it, right? It's not privileging mental models and abstractions that abstract and categorize reality from a 40,000 foot view, but rather staying in the immanence and staying in that liminal space and seeing what emerges or arises organically. And what Jeremy says is someone like Nora Bateson's work in complexity theory is actually quite consonant with Gebser's idea of integrality and diaphaneity, right? It is, Nora Bateson in her warm data work is trying to dance with multiple contexts as they imbricate over each other and inform each other, and understanding reality in this kind of fluid processual way. But she warns very explicitly over and over again not to overly, reify the abstractions, right? Reify the meta abstractions to the point where they become dissociative. And again, why I have a particular fascination with the race conversation is because I think race is something that is a mainstream issue that very much explores this tension between the lived embodied experiences and the larger sociological, political, historical abstractions that inform those experiences. And so that's a kind of an interesting, as a kind of sense-making leverage point to explore this tension. I like what race can bring to the discussion potentially.
Yeah, and again, mutual fan of Nora Bateson, like her talking about like trans contextuality. I really resonate with that, and it just I get the sense that like you cannot be a fan of Nora Bateson's work and be a bad person. I'm like, if you're into Nora Bateson, I'm like, probably if you're not if you're not on the way, if you're not a good person, you're at least on the way to being a better person. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely a fan of Nora Bateson. And yeah, and you mentioned like how you think race is a important leverage point. I'm like, yeah, because like, and I was about to ask you, is like, what exactly is it about like race? Like, why was it? Why do you think that it is such an important leverage point? Because you mentioned, I believe that you use the metaphor of like maybe like acupuncture. Is like if you maybe approach race, it could sort of maybe trickle down and have maybe systemic effects that like can translate to other realms. Like, can you go? Why exactly race do you feel is important?
Yeah, great question. So two reasons, right? One is that I just love how we met in the dangerous space. I just love inflammatory
Yes.
just the more controversial and heated and radioactive the topic is, the more I'm just like a heat-seeking missile. I just gravitate to it like flight of shit, right? I'm just like, because I think there's, also my background is training as a mediator and facilitator involved in conflict resolution, right? And so every conflict, the more heated the conflict is, the more potential there is for transformation, right? There's some gold there waiting to be excavated if handled skillfully. And so I'm always trying to see what are some of the most explosive, issues in the culture wars that we can really zoom in on. And if we can provide really good sense making and nuance and inject as much complexity into these subjects as possible, I think it can be a leverage point. And usually these issues are issues that strike to the core of our identities: race, religion, gender, that kind of thing, right? So that's kind of one subject of interest. The other reason why I think race is helpful is because it's really a bridge to what Hanzi and its metamodern vision calls the divisual, which he got from Gilles Deleuze, right? And the divisual is, to me, well, first I'll say the divisual is basically an integration of the individual and the collective. It's where it's not maintaining that hard dichotomy between the individual and the collective, but rather seeing how they intricately bleed together, right? We are entangled with society. We are entangled with background, contextual, institutional, historical, political, economic, cultural forces that inform our perspective, attitude, and worldview. But we're often blind to how that happens, because from our first person subjective experience and perspective, we just think that our opinions and our views are simply the way they are. We don't really have the meta awareness to understand how those views came into existence in the first place, and as you were saying, what our biases and blind spots are. So I'm really interested in reframing the conversation and using sense making around race as its own kind of psychotechnology to decenter the perspectives that we're most attached to, because we're blind about how they came into existence in the first place. When you understand all of the whole complex confluency of factors that went into creating who you think you are, it's a very Buddhist way actually of looking at things, right? It's a processual, interconnected, relational view of the self and of our perspective. And so we'll take a race, which is a controversial and inflammatory mainstream culture war issue, and use that as a portal into the truly integral, truly Nora Bateson-esque, truly metamodern complexity, divisual thinking and sense making, instead of a downward spiral into tribalism and reactionary politics and more division, right? So that's kind of how I've been vectoring into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, when you just said, oh yeah, I did go into your background, and yes, you were a conflict mediation specialist. I find that very interesting, and that kind of makes sense why the one session that I caught you in was the dangerous space, because I'm just like you. It's just like I see conflict, I see a controversial subject, I'm like I'm fly to shit. I'm like, whoo, yeah, let me get into it. And like you, actually, I don't know if you recall my kind of like rants during that session, because I was just speaking, I was going crazy in that session. Like every 10 seconds, someone would say something, and I would just fly out. And again, like that was the same. That was my first interaction with Aaron there, because what I was saying is like what I mentioned there. In my conversation, my episode with Aaron was like, I did have like sort of, I guess, this approach, like I wanted to move past gender. Again, the topic that we were talking about is what is a woman, and like brought out like is a trans woman a woman, and I was like, you know what, we should just move past all this stuff. It's like I got the gender blind crowd. It's kind of like what you're doing is trying to bridge the divide between the color blind and then the woke. It's just like my thing was like, I was saying like, you know what, why don't we just move past this, just pretend like gender doesn't exist. And then Aaron was like, ooh, wait a minute. He pushed back. He's like, actually, there's something, very deep, like archetypal within us that does embody like this yin yang, this masculine and feminine archetypes. And then like that helped me to get around to more like what he started to work on later with like the meta modern masculinity and like these archetypes. So again, it's very interesting that we're both like that, and we're not the typical East Asians, because it's like I could go into inside baseball, just like we're not so political, right? We're not like what I noticed, especially in like the United States, is like when people of like East Asian background, it's like when they usually tend to stay out of politics. But when they do get into politics, it's kind of like either like they're kind of like, oh yeah, they're kind of like conventional, like SJWs more type, or they're like they joined the Harvard discrimination lawsuit. They're like, no, why are you keeping us out of it? So it's very interesting. So I was wondering like what your thoughts on about like how like Asian Americans or East Asian Americans in particular, and like how we participate in like politics and like the social milieu in general.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts on that too. Are you familiar with Wesley Yang?
Oh yes. Oh wait, I forgot the book. What book did he just come
Soul
out
of
with?
Yellow Folk.
Yes. I read that. Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, he said he had a really interesting point, which is when I read this, I just laughed out loud because it's so resonated with my experience, which is that Asians are kind of natural mediators, especially in race issues, right? Because we're not really like, black or brown or indigenous people who have, I mean, what did he say? It's like you're not really looked at as like the oppressed minority archetype, but you're not a white person either. You're kind of in this liminal zone where people don't really know what the hell, where the hell they fit. And it's a weird thing because in some social justice circles, Asians are really considered and treated more like white people and having white privilege. In other circles, Asians are still considered to be people of color, oppressed minorities who where people should really strive to understand the challenges the Asian community faces in America, right? And what I've always said is, in my opinion, I think that generally speaking, the main issues that Asians tend to care more about are a little higher on Maslow's hierarchy than, let's say, the Black community. Like a lot of Asian people may not feel worried about being shot by the police if they get pulled over for a ticket, but there are other issues of like representation in things like sports or in things like entertainment industry, like the movie Crazy Rich Asians, Jeremy Lin, who I was a huge fan of, right? And so I think, these issues of esteem and recognition and being seen as, kind of cool or hip or sexy, right? I think these are more things that Asians care about. Masculinity, right? There's an entire Reddit thread on Asian American masculinity, something that a lot of my Asian guy friends and I have talked about and grappled with ourselves, right? So I think I also wrote a piece a while back. I never released it publicly. Maybe I'll show it to you later. But it was kind of a joke, but it was called like why Asians can be the first, or why Asian people who are culturally Asian can't have more of a tendency to start manifesting like integral and metamodern traits. My insight into that was, Asians I think do actually have a lot of traditional values that they keep with them or have internalized from their culture and from their families, right? I don't know how your parents raised you or how strict they were with like doing homework or whatever, right? But a lot of conservative values are affirmed in Asian culture. That's why Asians are actually, I think one political pundit said Asians could be like the Jews for the Republicans, like the kind of minority group that votes right, personal responsibility, hard work, and that kind of bootstrapping and focusing on education and not relying on government to take care of you, but at the same time still struggling with some of the issues that are advocated for in more woke or social justice circles, right? Wanting representation and wanting some kind of recognition or how do Asians as a minority group fit into larger cultural issues and diversity and, and also other factors like, we want to bring in the orange, right? There's kind of like the kind of tendency to focus on like business or economics or being financially, fiscally prudent and responsible and so forth. So there's a lot of these different qualities. I think Asian culture is kind of unique in if they can kind of integrate it together, if we can really integrate all of these different things and not in doing so kind of mediate the culture wars and some of these mimetic tensions. through our own experiences and cultural backgrounds. I don't know if that resonates with you or makes sense to you at all.
My God, like you don't understand. Like I went into this like in an early episode, like the creation was like the genesis of Noetic Nomads. Like I mean, like you could argue like this started from like you could argue like this is like an evolutionary process, and I'm just like manifesting it right now. But I mean like the more proximal genesis of Noetic Nomads was I did the Sensemaking 101 course for Rebel Wisdom, and two of my podmates were Robin Lever and Tia. And for a prompt, like we would go like into like these 20-minute kind of monologues, right? Where we go into like a specific topic. For this time, it was like a cultural topic that I want to speak about. And I specifically talked about the racial tensions inside the United States, and how I, as you know, as an Asian American, East Asian American, Korean American, whatever you want to call it, is just like our viewpoint is not being considered in this, you know, literally black-white divide. And it just like, honestly, and how our viewpoint is actually extremely important, because this part of it is kind of in this white crowd. It's like, oh yeah, we understand it, but part of it is also kind of in its black, you know, in this black, you know, frame. And part of it is just like is completely different. Like it's not contained in either of these poles, and it just. Again, just like you, I feel like we're natural mediators because we automatically are outside of the poles. Every time, like, you know, because like, for example, I mean, we could go into so many different things, but like, you want to talk about like diversity, you know, just like, oh yeah, like, you know, let's say like, you know, there's a company, and there's like, oh yeah, there's like, you know, like 20% black people. And then the mainstream media is like, hooray. But it's just like, you know, they say some sort of, but then they're like, then let's say there's like 70% minority in like, I don't know, a school. But the majority of those minorities, quote unquote, are Asian. They're like, no, it's not diverse enough. I was like, it's not diverse enough. There's only like, you know, like 30% whites there. It's like, oh, but it's not the right kind of diversity, you know. And that's what I'm like, it's like, and it's just like, and that's the thing. That's why like this start. I mean, again, like there's many reasons why perhaps like there can be a tendency for Asians in some contexts to shift right, is because we're not even being considered by this traditional you know, leftist crowd, right? And and again, it's like what I want to do is like I feel like it's again like with like what I guess what Alexander Bard calls the shamanoid role is like, because we're like automatically outside of this black-white divide, we can be the bridge that kind of is like, hey, I could talk to you white people, I could talk to you black people, I could talk to Hispanic, I could talk to all these different groups, and they don't consider me like, it's like I'm inoffensive enough where they can open up. And this is actually manifested in real life. Like I'll be in like a group of like all black people, and then they'll just be like, oh yeah. They'll start talking shit about white people. They'll even be like, hey, and they'll start talking about like chinks and stuff. And they're like, oh wait, sorry, yeah, we forgot you were there. like they'll just go into it, like they'll start dissing everyone, and they'll be like, they don't even realize I'm there. I'm just like, oh yeah, whatever, right? And there's even same thing in the white group. Like they'll start saying all this shit about all this other people, you know, and just, you know, that's the thing, like, you know, that's a reality. It's like when you have a specific group of people, it doesn't matter race, you know, gender, you know, whatever group, people are gonna say shit about other people and be more relaxed. And as an Asian American, because we're in that liminal space, and also possibly because we maybe have this reputation of being inoffensive, we're allowed to be those mediators. So yeah, I'm completely with you on that. And and it does make sense that actually that is what you're consciously doing as part of your work. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's one of the words in social justice circles called the impact of your identity, and it's just the way that how other people see you and perceive you in different circumstances, right? If you're a white comedian and you say the N-word, that's obviously going to land very differently than Chris Rock doing his bit on that, right? And so after thinking about that, I said, you know, how can I use my identity to my advantage, right? Since I know that I hold a kind of liminal space in the race wars, how can I leverage that to use to my advantage? And this is kind of weird to talk about, but like in several anti-racist groups I'm a part of, right? I'm the only non-white person in the group, and so in that context, I'm kind of looked at as the like person of color who's going to educate the white people, kind of a role. And I'm like, okay, if that's like if you're going to kind of give me a special privilege to lead the charge on that, right? Then I'm going to try to give you the most fucking integral, meta modern, you know, complex sense making on race as possible. and kind of leverage my identity in that way, right? Or if there's a mediation situation happening where race is implicated in the conflict, knowing that I'm Asian and I'm perceived as Asian, right, is kind of how my cultural and how my racial identity lands with these people, right? How can I use that to really kind of tone down the tension and use that to mediate more effectively, especially when race issues come up that were not an original part of the conflict, right? But if you have two people of different races arguing about something passionately enough, identity starts to become a part of it, eventually. So that's actually really given me a lot more confidence, really leading into these discussions and trying to mediate, knowing how I'm gonna impact the conversation.
Yeah. And then like, this is something I want to get into. And again, you mentioned that you're part of these anti-racist groups and that you're the only non-white person there. I think that's hilarious. So I was curious, like I actually like read about like maybe your kind of like a strategy with maybe the framing of it of anti-racism. So why anti-racism, and what do you think about this kind of anti-framework, and why did you decide to put that into DAR?
Mostly for clickbait, really. I mean, it's
really?
It is. I mean, someone did give me feedback, like the anti-framework is, it's still basing itself off of a negative position of what it wants to get away from. And, I explicitly laid out in the article that I'm generally not really for that, right? Like I want to be for something and lay out a affirmative vision of where to go instead of saying what not to do. So if I could change the name of it enough to be more of an affirmative direction, but also still conveying that it is kind of like relating to the traditional anti-racist, the mainstream understanding of what anti-racism means, so it can be a bridge, right? Because if it's too much of a adjacent leap to a new paradigm, I feel like
I see.
That's one thing too. Another one of my critiques of the sense-making community in general is there's all this wonderful stuff circulating in these very insulated communities. How do we start to really build a bridge towards more mainstream subcultures? And so this article, the anti-racist part, was an attempt to build that bridge with the mainstream anti-racist movement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely with the building bridges thing, and that's exactly actually when we're recording this, I'm actually holding a big event tomorrow with linking together, the sense-making community, but not even just the sense-making community, but even the constituent parts of the sense-making community, which are not necessarily integrated, right? It's like they kind of like they interface once in a while, but again, like Reb Wisdom and the Stoa and the Game B, and also like the intellect, some outside like integral thinkers I'm bringing in, including Jeremy. I mean, hopefully he shows up, and hopefully tomorrow is not a disaster. We don't know what's gonna happen by the time this is released. So again, like that's what I'm trying to do is the bridge. And so I see like your strategy with the with DAR, with the anti-racism framework, is kind of like we're kind of gonna step this way. And then you got all these AR people being like, oh, AR. And they're kind of like attracted into the orbit. And then you kind of like Trojan horse this stuff on them. Actually, what we should try to do is to build something, more, what is it, like a generative, as a building something rather than just constructive, rather than deconstructing everything. Because it's very simple to be anti-everything. You could be like, again, like, a simple example. You could be, oh, I'm anti-Trump. It's like, oh, you're anti-Trump. I'm anti-Trump as well. So what are you for? Oh, I'm for Hitler. I'm, just like, okay.
Right.
Yeah, it's like, that's not, okay, we're in the completely different camp. Like anti just says what you're not for. What are you actually for? So yeah, I mean, I'm completely with that. And I guess that's a clever little thing to try to get them onto your side. And one thing that I was interested in, again, speaking of, we're quote unquote categorized as Asian, right? And then you say Asian, but of course, Asian isn't. I have a problem with Asian. I mean, like I'm sure you do as well. I mean, obviously you're an integral thinker. You realize that the problems of labeling something, because of course, like Asia is a continent. And there are people like me, and then people like you, and there are differences between us. Yes, there are differences between Koreans and Japanese white people and Black people and all white people. There are differences, but there's also like South Asian, right? There's South Asian. It's like Indians and Japanese. Not only do they look different, they have widely different histories, viewpoints, and all that. And we can talk Russia and all that. So I was just wondering, like, even the term of Asian. I'm just wondering your specific viewpoint, because like, again, when we talk about Asian people, like if I'm in like if I'm talking with an Asian person who's like Japanese, I feel very different than if I'm talking with an Asian person who's maybe from Pakistan. You know, it's like, it's not the same, or like even from like the Philippines. It's very different. So I was wondering your concept of Asian and how like people use the term Asian, you know, in like America or the world at large. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think it really comes down to the effect of racialization, right? Where Asian, or as in this case more specifically East Asian, is a kind of racial category that's assigned or ascribed to people who look like me and you. And so that does have an impact on our own identity and our own sense making about the world. And versus more specifically like ethnicity and people specific cultural backgrounds, and then of course the other part of nationality, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that you're right. Like to me, it's kind of like, you know, putting Indians or Pakistanis in the same category is, or you know, we have South, and generally in terms of like the effects of racism towards people of South Asian descent are very different from East Asian, right? And so I think there is, at least for myself, I still have a sense of, you know, racial or cultural solidarity to a degree with, you know, I have friends, you know, from India, I've been to India, that kind of thing. I also have background teaching yoga and, you know, kind of going the whole Indian spirituality route too, right? But it's still not the same in terms of sharing, you know, like with me and you, some of the unique experiences that tend to affect East Asians. And so I think there's always room for more nuance and more precision, and at the same time being aware of the larger effects of racialization, in the sense that, you know, you're Korean, I'm Japanese, but yet there's still something about being an Asian American or being Asian, right, that kind of does capture some kind of commonality, even though we may be from slightly different parts of the world or have different, in some ways too, very different cultural differences between Korea and Japan. And you know, there's a joke I heard in a book by Francis Fukuyama. I don't know what you think about this, because I actually don't know a lot about Korean culture. I don't have any Asian friends who are Korean. But he said the joke is that a single Korean can defeat a single Japanese, but a group of Japanese will defeat a group of Koreans.
I don't even understand what is it. Yeah, I don't even understand the context behind that. So
I think what he was trying to say was that Korean culture, it tends to be more individualistic than Japanese culture.
Oh, I see.
Of course, I don't think that's not true. You guys beat us at soccer all the time now, right? Yeah, there are a lot of differences too. And as you mentioned earlier, like, you know, South Korea with a history of Christianity, Christian influence, very different from China, Japan, Mongolia, right? Other countries, right? So there are a lot of significant cultural differences that, you know, you and I may have in terms of how we were raised or the communities that we were brought up in. But there is still a larger effect of racialization that can kind of meta-categorize us as Asians and share a certain similarity of experience as Asians in America.
Yeah, I mean, like part of it is like I understand like the history of like the term even Asian American. Like I forget the exact, but it goes back to, I forget, the 60s or 70s, and like some, I believe, I don't know if like these Chinese Americans or someone, they really push for this term Asian American for us to actually be acknowledged as a group and be like, hey, we're not just like, you know, like these others, like we're actually a quote unquote group. And of course, I mean, the acknowledgement and the fact like, hey, like perhaps that we can be a group, we can have solidarity, and we can, if there is some sort of like this, like underrepresentation here, we could collectively be brought in because there is this frame of Asian American existing. But of course, like then again, it goes to like all the problems that come with that. And actually, to an extent, it's kind of unfortunate that like perhaps Indian Americans and like Chinese Americans do very well on like standardized tests, because it's just like, oh, they're all very smart and they're very educated. So like it gives us a basis. It justifies the fact that categorization exists, even though you don't hear about like people from, you know, Japanese Americans, you know, getting like attacked and shot, you know, because they think that, you know, they're part of Al Qaeda or something, right? But you hear that all the time for people, you know, from Pakistan and Bangladesh and India. So it's like, it's very different, and like again, like there's a reason for that, but it's also unfortunate. And again, like in the UK, the term Asian is actually reserved for people who are like of South Asian descent, of Indian and Pakistani. And like I don't know if they refer to like people like us as more like, I don't know, like something else. It's not Asian. I don't know if it's like Oriental or something. So I mean, like that's even an interesting frame. Yeah, and so I mean, so I actually would like to get into this this sort of Japanese and Korean thing because you told me about how like, I believe this was all prompted by they were asking about movies and Stoa Discord, and I was like, oh yeah, watch Joint Security Area by Park Chan-wook, the director behind Old Boy, and I talked about how like talked about South Korean movies, and then somehow it led to my giving this massive spiel about Han, right? About and how like Han is embodied within our cinema, and how the history of Korea, of how like I mean, just I'm gonna give you actually like I want to know like your thoughts on my framing first of all of saying China is big brother, Korea is little brother, and Japan as evil cousin. I'm so sorry, but that's kind of how I see it. Maybe at least as a Korean. So I was wondering, first of all, I'm sorry I didn't defend you. What do you think about that, Frank?
I'd have to agree with the Japanese part. I mean,
oh, you would? Okay.
Yeah, I unfortunately very ashamed to say so, but yeah, the China part is interesting because I don't know a lot about how Koreans feel about China, so that's interesting to me. I don't have a lot to say about that, but the Japanese part I definitely can say, yeah, that sounds about right. Historically and
Yeah.
even presently, those tensions are still very prominent.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't like, and actually, like now that like when I think about it over time, like there is some shadow. I mean, there's collective like national shadows with all these different countries, right? And I think part of it when I refer to Japan as evil cousin, there is a shadow aspect there for coming from me because of like the colonial past, and even before that the repeated invasions and whatnot. But actually there's also like there's some Japanese shadow, kind of like, hey, we've always been here on the side, right? And we wanted to come onto the mainland and join you guys by conquering, but we still wanted to come onto the mainland, and you wouldn't let us conquer you. How else were we going to be part of this whole community? So I also see that as coming. And yeah, I mean, like I was wondering, like if we could get into like Japanese and Korean relations, and with with you coming from a Japanese American background, and I'm coming from a Korean background, and like just like it's very easy for me to like come up with like I'm very relaxed in this sort of conversation, because like it's one of those things where it's just like you don't realize like what you've been missing until you're actually there. Because like before, if I have like a conversation on race with white people, right? I could talk to them a bit about it, but there's always a part of me like, I can't, I can't go that, be as relaxed and open up as much as I do. Same thing with black people. I can have a relationship with black people and talk about, like the struggles of minorities and whitey and all of that. But there's also part of me like, no, I can't quite say it.
Right,
so, but
right.
now it's like, now that I'm talking with you, it's like, oh, now I could just be like, whatever. I could talk about, being a yellow face and not worried about, about like how it's going to come off. So, yeah, so I was just wondering, like what your thoughts on about Han, because like you said that was interesting. I was like, what you thought, I mean, like, do you see that personified? And for those not aware, I'm sorry, what I'm saying is all over the place, right? So Han is basically like you could kind of collapse it as like the Korean shadow of deep sorrow, which kind of underlies everything we do, which makes us like incredibly competitive, but also leads to us having like the highest suicide rates in the developed world, but also, but like we get this amazing cinema in like this K-pop, and we're just spreading it all over the world because, we want to tell the world how awesome we are because of how much we actually hate ourselves, which, because of our history of like colonial domination, whether it's from the Japanese and the Chinese, the Manchus, the Mongols, and then the United States coming in, our country being torn apart. And we're literally at war with ourselves. We hate ourselves. We want to kill ourselves. And then we're also the plastic surgery capital of the world, because that's how much we hate ourselves. So I was just wondering what your thoughts on like this whole East Asian dynamic, and particularly with like China, Japan, and Korea.
Yeah, where to begin? I mean, it's really, I think it's really unfortunate, a lot of the historical events that led to this, World War II, and what's very troubling to me is that Japan has kind of had a resurgence of that nationalistic kind of thing going on, right? I mean, it's a little bit, especially with the imperial history of Japan in World War II, it's a bit of a yikes to start seeing that crop up again. And unfortunately, like my uncle, my dad's brother who lives in Tokyo, has kind of caught the Make Japan great again
Oh
bug.
yeah.
And starts denying that the rape of Nanjing ever happened, and it's kind of like Holocaust denial for like white supremacists, or right.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that comes from, but or if it's just a way to kind of cope with the collective trauma or collective shadow of all these historical atrocities. And Japan has always been a very tightly knit, very ethnically homogeneous and insulated nation, which has, I think, to be honest, I think that has contributed to some of the success Japan has had. But there's also a huge shadow in that, and a tremendous amount of just intolerance and lack of, an integral theory, lack of like a green consciousness other than like environmentalism, right? So thankfully things are changing, and now the schools have more of a lot of like mixed race kids.
Yeah.
And so the attitudes are changing, but like people like my grandparents who lived in a fishing village in the Fukui prefecture in Japan, I mean, they're probably like full on racist, like that's just the generation. They're like 80, right? And so a lot of those tensions, it really would be like indistinguishable from, it's like a time machine going back to like the 40s, right? And they just kind of kept that attitude alive. So yeah, but it was so great for me to read about your beautiful kind of regurgitation, right? That spontaneous, the energy behind the Han thing, like you can really feel the tension. I think that's been part of the kind of the Korean. I think that one of the differences is that I don't think Japan, the beef that Japanese have with other Asian countries is not. It's not as much of a two-way street as the Koreans feel about the Japanese in terms of the real dislike, because the Koreans never really fucked the Japanese over in the same way that the opposite happened, right? I'm losing my voice. So
well, we did beat your ass with the turtle boats. You remember that?
Yeah, that's right.
We kicked your ass with that. Yeah.
That was from my favorite video game, Age of Empires 2.
Age of Empires. Oh my god, I love it. Yeah.
I think that was when Hideyoshi invaded Korea, the unsuccessful invasion. I think that like the 1600s.
Yeah.
But I think that after World War II, and I like to hear the Korean side of this too, right? After World War II, the Japanese needed to channel their energy, their collective national spirit or psyche towards something that was not the state, because that's fascism. That was what happened in World War II. So they redirected the energy to business, and now the person who was like your I don't know, your supreme superior was your employer.
Yeah.
Right. That and so that the role that your boss has in Japan is really a personal role. It's like they'll attend your wedding, right, or even officiate your wedding, and like there's a sense. It's changing a lot now in Japan, but there's always been a real sense of loyalty to your job. Like this is your religion, basically.
Yeah.
Or like a family, and so it's an interesting thing about like I want to ask you about Han, and like in the Korean psyche, like what in terms of channeling or even sublimating a lot of these hurt feelings or historical traumas, what was the target they were directed to, consciously or unconsciously, right? Like what was galvanizing the Korean identity, pushing off of what, contrasting with what?
Oh yeah, I mean, like the way I interpret it is, again, I think it's just the constant domination. It's the constant humiliation, and it's just the inferiority complex is really, because we have a deep that's really what it is, that I spoke about that in the post. It's the inferiority complex. It's like Koreans, like, this is why like there's probably no like other group in the world that is such a try-hard in kind of like proselytizing how awesome they are with like K-cinema, K-pop, K-dramas. They always love K cuisine, K everything. It's like they love doing this. It's just they love and they're also like avid learners, but not even just like in school, but like I heard about, like, for example, like I used to work for like a French bakery, like the top one like in the area, right? And then the chefs were from Paris, and they told me that like over there, like the people that they see in the classes trying to learn about French cuisine or about the French pastries the most is like people from Korea. it's just like they just love learning, and they love kind of mixing it with their own thing, and then kind of like just transporting it, exporting it to the world. And it comes down to, and part of it is like this sort of, again, these millennia of like getting our ass beat and never having like our own sovereignty, and like just getting, and then talking about identity again, like we went from Korea to North and South Korea because of the pull of because of the superpowers, like kind of like throwing us into a ring, kind of like cockfighting with each other. And it's just like, where is our sovereignty? Like, how do we control our destiny? We don't have we don't have the hard power. So what we do is we use soft power with all this different stuff. So that's what's driving it. Like all this export of all this media. It's like, that's why, like, this is interesting. Like, I remember like a few years ago, like when K-pop, like after Gangnam Style and all that, like I don't think it's a coincidence that Gangnam Style was Korean, right? It's like, it's just like that Han, like, and the thing about a Gangnam Style, Psy's music, right? It's basically a ripoff of LMFAO. Remember all that stuff? Like, do you remember LMFAO? Like, but do you know what I'm talking about? The it's that club music.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like, I forgot what it's called, but it was basically a complete ripoff of LMFAO, which is doing big in the United States. He took that, he put the Korean Han into it, right? And then it just exploded. And like, not coincidentally, like literally less than a year after Gangnam Style came out, LMFAO stopped doing music. Like that's what happened. It just like, that goes into it. It's like K-pop. And I remember going back to the topic, I read a comment. It was a K-pop versus J-pop video. Like I watched it, right? Because like back then I was like, oh my God, Korean people. It's like, again, this inferiority complex, right? Like, and there's still a part of me that's there, but like for a long time, like I had this really, really bad complex, not with just being Korean American, but just being Asian, East Asian in general. And so what I would do to boost my self-confidence, I would go and check out all the Asian Korean stuff that's doing well. So I go into this K-pop or J-pop video, and they're like, this K-pop thing, it's gonna be whatever. Wait until a few years until like China figures out how to copy the K-pop model, and then C-pop is gonna take over. Well, last thing I checked is 2020, and no one gives a shit about C-pop. And that's the thing. It's because it's coming from this Han. It's what drives us, and that's why I referred to in my post I made that Koreans have been referred to as the Jews of Asia, right? It's like, it's this Han, this drive, this again, and like there's another parallel with like the mandatory military drafting in Israel, mandatory military service in Israel, mandatory military service in South Korea. So there, and why do we have the mandatory military service? Because our countrymen are trying to kill us. Because they're, we've been egged on by the superpower. So again, this is like existential drive, right? And yeah, so like, again, like all this thing, like we hate ourselves. We're on the brink of extinction at all times, right? We're Japan's right over here, North Korea's right over there, China's right over there. And it's just like, what the hell are we gonna do? And they're just like, that's what's making Koreans do this thing. And that's quite possibly what's helping drive my thing. And maybe it's not a coincidence that, like the one person who's like in the quote unquote sense making space, I don't know how you want to refer to me, a steward, caretaker, that happens to be, like a Korean dude. I mean, obviously you're part of this, and there are other East Asians around here, but like specifically like embedded within the sense making space is like, maybe that's what's driving me, is because of that, Han. So yeah, that's my perspective on it.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. The Jewish analogy is interesting to me, because I think when you look at different, the history of different civilizations, the ones that have been embodied in that liminal space have usually had a rough time. Like, for example, or even today, are implicated in some major world conflict, right? I mean, you look at, for example, like what Alexander Dugin's saying on Russia and the Eurasian identity that he's trying to go for. Russia's, it's like, are we European? No, we don't. We're pushing off against the Europeanness, right? So are we? There's kind of like the Asian Mongolian side of the, the Eastern, Siberia, and right, and so it's like, well, what are we doing here? Then you go south to like the more like Muslim parts, then you start getting into like areas like the Middle East, for example, where it's like, again, it's between, it's like, well, are we Asian, are we the West, or are we kind of in the middle? And so whenever a country or civilization is in that liminal zone between mighty established east west or whatever, empires, like the Jews constantly going the history of the Jewish diaspora.
Yeah.
And so it's like to find your identity can be more difficult, or can be, there's more angst behind it. There's that Han, there's that kind of like driving that. And I think the Japanese, unfortunately, they've always had the superiority complex involved with Koreans, right? And so it's kind of like this kind of looking down. And I think that in some ways, especially after World War II, Japan was humiliated, and they had to go through their process of rebuilding, but then quickly had the Japanese miracle and became really at least until the 90s, their economic trajectory was unprecedented in the world, and was right behind the United States until they had their inflation and housing. I think it was like their bubble and the crash in like the somewhere in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
And so their economic growth has been pretty stagnated since then for various reasons. But there is a sense of like the Japanese, they're kind of like established. Like there isn't like that the Han feeling the Koreans have that you're describing. It doesn't. That kind of petered out early on, definitely, because of how they kind of got comfortable in the setup of being an economic superpower and finding their own kind of international economic identity, exporting, cars and, everything the Japanese market. Although now you guys are like beating us in the car market even, right? Yeah. But I mean, let me ask you this though. Do you think the Korean sense of identity and it is less nationalistic than Japan? Or is there still for South Korea, is there still like a strong kind of national flavor, or is the competition Han more of like an individual level of competitiveness?
Well, I mean, like I would say it's a both. I guess I'll give it a both and, because like there is that, like when we're very fiercely Korea. It's coming from a place, and it's coming from a place of weakness. Like I mentioned in my post on about Han, it's like I see parallels kind of like with like other countries like Poland, right? Like whenever I see like Polish people being really nationalistic, you can see them desperately saying Polska, yeah, Poland is awesome, even though you got your ass beat like all the time. It's just like I could sense it. I could sense this feeling. It's like, oh my god, it's like we're awesome. We want to believe. It's like that kind of thing. So there is a part of that, and again, it's just like, but it's also internal. Like the South Korean like competitive drive, it's insane, which is why again we have the highest suicide rates in the developed world. Like it is insane. Like people like I hear about it from like Korean relatives and like people who I talk to who live in South Korea. It's like they're constantly like, if someone says oh yeah, my kid did this and this, what's the reaction to that? Your friend tells you how awesome their kids are doing, like, oh yeah. It's like shit. It's just like, it's like, oh, it's kind of seeing it as an attack on them, So everyone's trying to be better and better, which is why we're constantly, we're overachievers. We're tryhards, like Joe Rogan constantly talks about on his podcast, his friend, I forgot his name, but his Taekwondo friend, he was talking about he's the hardest working dude he's ever heard in his life. He was he was doing like pre-med. He was like doing like studying for this. He was doing like karate tournaments. He was like a national level champion, and he was getting like 5 hours of sleep. And he would just be like a zombie, just walking. He was just a walking zombie, yet he was still accomplishing. It's like it's that drive. And there's this sort of mindset. It's called the Bali framework. Bali means fast. It's like Bali, fast, which happened right after, like after the Korean War. The country's devastated. So how do we build? Bali, go. And we didn't care about safety. We didn't care about people's feelings. We didn't care about nothing. We're just go. So there is this nationalistic framework coming from a place of inferiority, outwardly, but there's also inwardly, like, yeah, we're definitely at odds with each other. And this sort of tension, this creates greatness. At the same time, you have people who can't handle it. they end it, they drop out of society and whatnot. Yeah. So there's definitely, there's pros and cons to this. And I don't know, in the future, maybe in the future we'll progress this. Perhaps as a nationality, progress to another stage, another developmental stage, which perhaps we are. I mean, I actually mentioned this in the post. We are under a military dictatorship until 1988, the Seoul Olympics. It's not a coincidence that at the year of the Seoul Olympics, we got rid of our dictatorship because like, hey, everyone's watching us, get the hell out of here. Let's bring in quote unquote democracy, whatever that is. Since then, 1988, we elected a female president. We impeached the female president and then we replaced her. So this is like the rate of like change that we're doing in America and in South Korea. And then we're like a few steps, like in a province in South Korea actually instituted UBI since the start of COVID. And the politician behind the UBI initiative is actually, planning on a presidential run. So we're maybe perhaps a presidential election away from actually instituting the first UBI for a country in the world. So like, yeah. So again, like this is like, yeah, this competitive drive is like this Han is what's I believe driving all of this. So that's my take on that. Yeah.
Wow. That would be awesome if Korea has their first UBI. I mean, that would be I'd be really interested to see how that. I mean, well, do you know the economist named Ha-Joon Chang?
Yes. I saw his series on like new economic thinking or something like that. I watched this entire thing. Yeah, definitely. I love him.
Yeah, and he's a critique of capitalism, and or that's kind of one of his main. He has a book called like 23 Minutes of Capitalism or something, and he talks about how South Korea's that hyper competitive Han, very very capitalistic to the bone.
Yeah,
and I think UBI can really soften that a little bit. Or at least provide a little bit of cushioning economically for people, where that may create that could create a bit of a cultural shift or something.
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of like go with a kind of like the Marxist line of thought. I guess it's like, capitalism will inevitably like kind of eat itself and then lead to something like a UBI and beyond that. But the thing is, like, I do like for the thing about UBI, like I see that as a stopgap to something beyond that. Like, again, I've mentioned before, the best frame that I've heard is the universal basic assets. Proposed by Douglas Rushkoff, because the thing about UBI is like, yeah, UBI is great. The consumers have money to buy, but who are they going to buy it stuff from? The big oligopolists, from these tech giants, who still live in this capitalistic framework where they're the ones running everything, and it's kind of the retention of the colonials mindset where it's like, okay, you can buy, we'll give you money to buy, but you have to buy from us. So yeah, so I'm definitely, and I see that moving beyond that. I don't know if you want to start going into like where you see us going, like maybe politically, sociopolitically, with going from capitalism and like a post-capitalist society.
Wow. Yeah. I read that article by Rushkoff. I mean, my question, in principle, I think he's totally right in the sense that we need to look deeper than mere money or subsistence wages, even if it's universal and just getting a check in the mail, right? To ownership structures.
Yeah.
And the real, like you can have a UBI and that could hold people over, but it's kind of like crumbs when the oligarchs are still making, like Jeff Bezos making $13 billion a day, exactly. Right? And so it doesn't really get to the underlying root of the structure of capitalism that creates all inequality to begin with. And I'm totally for that in principle. And Rushkoff doesn't really lay out the details of what that would look like or how we would transition there. And that's always my question, right? Yeah. Is you can have more of like a worker co-op model where, in the Marxist perspective, right, the workers are owning the means of production. So you have a democratization of the workplace, and somehow the worker interests and stakeholders are more locally within the company instead of being dictated by the abstract forces of global capital and market flows, where bankers and investors are creating the flow of capital that creates worker alienation. And that I can see how that works on a local level. There are some technical challenges with issues of not being able to get loans from banks to start up these kind of firms, but I can see that happening. But on a bigger scale, if we want to continue with our current system of with publicly traded companies, Like, is there a way to bring workers to is there a way to, more create more equality in everyone being able to own shares of any company, even if you don't work for the company. So there is kind of a difference, and there are other techniques like or methods like baby bonds. Robert Reich has this idea of like a nest egg where everyone just gets a certain share from birth, and it's kind of like a 401k or IRA for all.
Yeah.
And so that's a little different though from the more of the worker co-op model, which is more of like workers locally owning the business, and so it's no longer a publicly traded company, right? So maybe something, maybe a little bit of both, and then all the workers can also still get shares for other companies that are not democratized in the same way. So I don't know, maybe like a combination. There's some other methods I've looked into, but again, I've never seen one really clear way to make that happen where I would have full confidence in running with that if I was a politician pushing for that idea. I don't know. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, like, again, like I don't have a framework. I don't know who actually has a real like workable framework, at least as of yet, though. Like, people are experimenting. I mean, like the term that I love throwing around, because it just seems like it just seems the most eloquent, or at least the sexiest, is fully automated luxury communism. It's just kind of like, okay, once we could get technology, like, again, like this is how like this goes along with the Marxist point of view. It's like capital is going to eat itself. It's like, okay, driving lower costs, what does that do? That means, okay, we got to bring in machines. And then it's like, so so not everything, but we're gonna have automated pretty much this, that, and the other. And then instead of pushing for lower and lower costs for everything, being like, okay, eventually it's gonna get to the point where it's like, okay, if society as a whole owns the machines, owns the means of production, is very much like, like has universal basic assets, they have a right since birth to the profits or the value that's generated by the machines, then it could be something like that. And like, again, I like this. I really enjoy this more grounded approach, which is kind of like one of my critiques with more conventional game B thinking, where it's like, oh, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna exit to a proto B, and we're gonna have like a little society over here, and it's just like, but it's like, how can it be more grounded? And what I found in my research, which I don't know if that's still one of your goals, is that your dream is to start the world's first integral political party, and even launch a campaign to be what maybe the first integral president. So first thing that popped up is Yang, right? And it's like, Yang is actually, I think Yang actually has a lot of momentum for 2024. I don't know if this country even exists by that point, right? I don't know what's gonna happen. Like, I'm honestly wondering about that. So I'm just wondering, is that still something you're thinking about? And like, what is inspiring you, and what's driving you to kind of go with that if you're still going on that trajectory?
Sure, it was a very bold, very ambitious kind of proposal or idea that I've had, and yeah, I think Yang. I mean, I was a huge supporter of Yang in the primary, and he kind of looks like a prophet pushing for the UBI, and then
I know, right?
Pandemic, and everyone's
Exactly.
like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, right? And post campaign, he's been doing a lot of great work on his podcast, and he's probably one of my favorite mainstream politicians. But my idea of the integral metamodern game B sense-making political movement or campaign, and I'll just say too, it's a shame because Jim Rutt talks about his Emancipation Party.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh, young people were interested. I'm like, what the hell? If that was around right now, I would be like so into that, right? It's a shame that kind of fell off for whatever reason. But my idea was twofold. It's similar to my idea with focusing on race as such a controversial issue, and then therefore kind of leveraging that into a social acupuncture point. Politics is obviously the same thing, where a lot of people in the sense-making community feel politics is so broken, and there's such a cynicism that the best idea is to create this adjacent attractor and make an orthogonal leap to a completely new paradigm that circumvents the existing completely broken system. There's a lot of merit to that. But my position is, number one, we can't get away from politics, right? It's like, if you really want to create your little utopia, it's like, well, where are you going to go? That's still within the boundaries of some nation state that's going to be affected by policy, right? So we better make sure that from the top down level, even though even from a complexity perspective, we understand that top down solutions may be limited in some way, that can't be overlooked. Someone's always being implicated and everything's always political to someone or to some group. So it's good to be mindful of that. And even if you don't win, if we run for office or whatever, I still think that if you campaign creatively enough like Yang, that can also generate a cultural revolution and build community around really innovative, really creative, outside the box ways of thinking about politics and systems change that can have more of a mainstream impact. And what really excites me is there's a lot of jargon in all of these communities, where all these sense-making communities we're part of. How can we translate them into a language where the average normie person can understand and relate it to their reality? And I think that's, to me, politics kind of symbolically represents building that bridge and stepping outside the bubble, and maybe a natural flowering of the sense-making movement once it's reached a mature enough level to start reaching out, right? I don't know if that'll ever happen, and I've also met a lot of people who don't even think that's a good idea. But for me, it's not so much like this is what I think is the best idea. It's more just this is what I'm passionate about, and I can't not think about it, right? So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it and dreaming it up.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I think, I mean, this jives perfectly what we were talking about how, like, you know, Asians, East Asians, it can be that bridge, that kind of emissary between all these different groups. Because Yang is like Yang's campaign, right? It was just like he the biggest supporters, like he was talking about like not left, not right, forward. It's kind of like what you're doing, not woke, not colorblind, diaphanous, right? It's like, it's the same thing. And then when I saw like Yang supporters, so many of them were like people from like, I was a former Trump supporter, but when I heard Yang talk about he actually cares about us, he's not just looking at us as like a flyover state, as like just white trash, you know, all this stuff, like, you know, that, like, you know, the traditional you know, the liberal politics has turned into, you know, with the shaming all the right and all that. It's just like he was really bridging them together. And as you stated, when you talk about, you know, like speaking like, you know, like English instead of gobbledygook, you know, it was just like he was actually, you know, he was actually speaking to them. He was actually translating that. And I mean, there's a part of me that like there's, I guess, the more like purist, maybe radical part of me that was thinking like, you know, like Yang is like, it's like I like what he's saying, bringing these ideas, these new ideas, well, new to the mainstream point of view, that like, you know, like the UBI and all that stuff. And it's like, but there's still part of me, it's like, you're still a little mainstream, Yang. He's like, you're using all these mainstream points. But when I actually look at it in the long game, it's like, that's it. Like, if he wasn't like, he's the one, you know, again, you talk about him possibly being as a prophet with, you know, with COVID happening with UBI, just like, you know, like, again, like he did not become, you know, the candidate for 2020. Of course, he was partly because of the mainstream media conspiracy against him. I mean, let's be real. I mean, everyone has pretty much admitted. Yang even said like, this is happening right now. But it's just like, I mean, like the stuff that it may happen if we get through the next 4 years, and possibly 2024. I mean, like before, like I remember when I first came across him, like I believe maybe 2017 or something. I was like, oh, look, it's just like, you know, this Asian guy running for president. I was like, whatever. But now I'm just like, honestly, 2024, if we get to that point, playing the long game, which quite frankly, I think we do pretty well as a group, I think he has a decent chance. So I mean, I think that's very interesting. And again, I see him embodying the bridge role, and it's just like, you're doing the bridge role, and then I'm doing the bridge role. Like, we're all literally doing that right now. That's, I mean, like, yeah. So I just think that's really interesting how that's actually playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and someone made the comment too that if Trump won the election, Yang may have had a better chance to win in 2024, right? Because he may not run as president, given that Biden or Kamala would be the incumbent Democratic president. But you know, I do think that the whole bridge role is something I'm just really passionate about and excited about, and how could politics be in some ways even more than policy, right? Because it is more than policy, and if we're already entangled with all of these crazy cultural issues and culture wars, where someone who really was able to take the mimetic mediation skills and apply that in the political realm, and to make that an attractor and build a community around that, and launch a cultural movement that way instead of being in our own little echo chambers, which are wonderful right now. But I always get so like antsy, you know, or like just feeling how do I bring this out there more? How do I connect with more mainstream movements outside of sense making spaces? And you know, luckily, being a mediator and being in the mediation field and profession, a lot of mediation organizations have really been doing promoting a lot of stuff that Peter and Rebel Wisdom and Integral Theory has been talking about, right? Is you know, doing more mimetic mediation in their own way and taking the skills out into the streets, basically, which is what I'm really excited to try to do. And you know, what better way to do that? What better excuse to do that than to run for office and knock on people's doors and talk to people and build a community around systems and political change that's really, you know, up to date with how it should be, instead of this totally ass backwards crazy shit show that we have right now.
I mean, like, yeah, and this is something that I realized that like this mimetic mediation thing, and the moment I think about mimetic mediation, I think about Peter Lindbergh and the Stoa, right? It's like, you know, part of his long game is to get all these tribes together, but the Stoa is more so, again, it takes the meta role of like just bringing them together and kind of like, you know, again, it just kind of like, and then like incubating psychotechnologies, right? But not actually playing the active role of going out. Like it's like bringing them in, but it's not like necessarily embodying them and going outward. And that's what I see kind of like what myself doing, or at least, you know, attempting to do. And of course, what you're trying to do is like, okay, we're trying to like, we got this, and then we're actually going to do it, which is why like I'm going from my event tomorrow, right? It's called The Next Generation of Sense Makers and Change Makers. Because again, you can make all the sense you want, right? And like, you know, there's a lot of people who like can stay in their head. Yeah, I'm gonna make sense all day. I don't understand. It's like they could do this. They go to 8,000 Zoom sessions and they're just like, oh yeah, I'm making sense. I'm making sense. Okay, but why are you making sense? Like, what are you making sense of? Why? He's like, what are you gonna do, you know, with this sense that you've made? And again,
it really doesn't make any sense.
it doesn't make sense. Yeah, it makes sense. It's like sense, you know, again, this has been thrown out all the time. It's mental masturbation. It's just like you're not producing, you're not fucking, you know, you're creating something, you're you know, you're doing this all day. But you know, again, that's what I see myself doing, and like I'm glad that you're doing the same. So yeah, I mean, awesome. I mean, just amazing conversation. And like I'm just wondering like if you have any thoughts for the audience. I mean, this has been awesome. We went over, you know, Japanese Korean relations, about how Asians can play that role because of mediators, of bridges in the liminal space, and how we want to go out in the world, and your DAR framework, which I think is very interesting. I saw that was your first Medium post you made, right? It's got it was released 10 days ago, and it's already got over 100 claps. 100 claps is pretty good for your first Medium post, right? And like,
is that? I don't know the what's like the,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah. I just checked today, 105 claps. That's, I mean, like for someone who just literally just started like a week ago, that's pretty awesome. So again, like I would love to bring this out to the world, because I mean, I think that's a really good framework, something that goes beyond this bipolar view of woke versus colorblind. So, I mean, I just wonder if you had any closing thoughts for our audience and what you want them to take away from this.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Albert. This was a really fun, and what I really appreciate about talking about today, and also talking to you about specifically, was I think we were probably, if I can recall, or as far as I know, maybe the first, you know, conversation or podcast episode in a sense-making space where we explicitly talked about race and racial identity, and specifically about, you know, being Asian.
Yeah.
And you know, there are more, you know, percentage-wise, more Asians in these communities than any other race. And I was tempted to reach out to Peter and ask if he wanted to do a Stoa session exploring everything we talked about today in regard to like Asians and culture wars and mimetic mediation.
Interesting.
And so I guess the final thing I'll say to the audience, to whoever's watching, is, you know, if there are any Asians watching this, and people want to continue the conversation around this topic, I would love to do that, and just to kind of coalesce a little like Asian sense making kind of, not to be, you know, kind of go against my entire Diaphanous kind of race essentialism or whatever, tribalism or whatever, but I would just be curious to see if people were interested in this, and my position, right, is I think that some people are afraid of explicitly acknowledging race and racial identity for good reasons, and I completely understand, right? That's what I kind of warned about in the article, but I like to lean into it more now that we've started this conversation. Maybe that'll get the ball rolling. So hope to hear from anyone.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates, and it's just like it's a tricky topic, right? It's very complex. You can't just be like, hey, let's do this and that. It's like, we gotta find our way around it. And actually, I had an interaction recently with a certain former prominent Game B member about possibly starting something regarding underrepresented groups, in the sense-making space. So yeah, there are definitely people out there who like us, and not just specifically like Japanese or Korean or whatnot, but just like our voices are not being heard, and perhaps incubating it, right? Because here's the thing, like I mean, it's just like when you have like, I mean, this is the thing, but safe spaces gets a really bad rap, right? The whole term, the whole concept, because of how it's implemented, and by, I guess, the radical, like, I don't even know what to call them, the whole trigger warning crowd, like that crowd, right? And it's just like they want to be protected at all times, and they want to vilify everyone, like, you're attacking me. But the way I see it, like, there has to be, in order for like groups for everyone to come into their fullness, especially when they're part of any sort of group, it's like there has to be some sort of like semi-permeable membrane where just like, okay, we can be here. We don't have to worry about being attacked for this, that, and the other, right? We don't have to like put on a front. We could just be here. We could be ourselves, and we could talk openly, like you and I, about something like race, about something from the Asian, the East Asian, the Korean, Japanese American context, and not have to do it from like this fake frame where it's just like, I have to talk with white people about race in a certain way, or talk about black people about race in a certain way. It's like we can actually talk about it in a more embodied, real, honest way, and from that comes more, productive conversations, which we can then come out of our semi-permeable membrane, and then perhaps, interact with the world in a more full and, a more whole place, and contribute to, a more integrated, community. So I'm totally with that. Yeah. And that's amazing, Ryan. So again, thank you so much for coming on, and it's been amazing. Again, the first exclusively yellow face episode in the Sensemaking community. Watch this, rewind it, send it to all your people. This is what it's all about. So
I hope that's put in parentheses in the title there, Albert.
What, the yellow face?
Yeah. But just really quickly too, I mean, that was a beautiful, steel manning of the safe space thing. But, from my perspective too, it's kind of like a Japanese thing of being polite to the group, where I think when you're talking about a lot of identity specific issues, especially minority identity issues, a lot of people are just not interested. And it's not there's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't experience what that group experience, of course, that's not going to be very interesting. And so it's just a way of like getting a more specific conversation that people are welcome to join, but also being mindful that if people are not interested, then that they don't have to join. And so it's not like I don't have to worry about like taking up airtime talking about something that no one else wants to talk about. Right?
Exactly.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, brother. This is fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, again, so where can people find out more about the great Ryan Nakade, Dar, and all the amazing work you're doing?
Oh yeah, I'm on a lot of social media. So like the Growing Down episodes were on Jeremy Johnson's YouTube channel. This is Jeremy Johnson, and then the Growing Down episodes are all on there on his YouTube channel. I'm on Facebook at Ryan Nakade, and Twitter at Nakade Ryan. And my one and only medium.
Pretty awesome debut, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Got it. Yeah. I'll link all that in the show notes. Everyone definitely check them out. I mean, if you came out with one Medium post and it's like that, I mean, imagine what happens with the second or third. So again, check them out. I mean, amazing stuff from Ryan. And that's it for another episode of Noetic Nomads. Peace out, everyone, and step up because the world needs you. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
All righty. And we are done.